Well, we're here with Professor Rupert Sheldrake. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Joe, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your own journey from atheism to Christianity?
Well, I was brought up as a regular Christian. My parents were Methodists, and I went to an Anglican boarding school. But I was educated as a scientist, and in England at the time, um, atheism just was part of a package deal. If you learned science, you became an atheist and regarded religion as old-fashioned and dogmatic, and science as liberating and exciting and stuff. So I bought into that general model without thinking too much about it. Um, but I came back to an interest in spirituality, partly through traveling in India. In 1968, I was spent 2 or 3 months traveling through India. I was giving talks at Indian universities on science. I was doing research at Cambridge in cell biology. Um, and while I was there, I met people who were Hindus and Muslims and Jains and Sikhs, people from different religions, um, who struck me as being rational, credible people. And I was just impressed by the spiritual quality of their lives. Um, and when I got back to England, I sort of became more interested in exploring at least consciousness. I started doing transcendental meditation and yoga. And so I got really interested in Indian spirituality because it seemed to me talking about the bigger dimensions of consciousness. I later went to work in India. I had a job in an agricultural research institute. And it was while I was working in India that I found myself, to my surprise, drawn back to a Christian path. I was confirmed in the Church of South India, which is an Anglican Methodist ecumenical church, and started going to church regularly. I then came across a wonderful teacher called Father Bede Griffiths, an English Benedictine monk who was living in a Christian ashram in South India. And he was a wonderful teacher who introduced me to the mystical tradition in Christianity, the deeper theological traditions that I had never heard about before. And I lived in his ashram while I wrote a book called A New Science of Life, a science book. And then I came back to England after living in India for 7 years altogether. And when I got back, I rediscovered the Christian tradition, and it was such a liberating thing to do. I was reconnected with the traditions of our parish churches and cathedrals, and just rediscovered the riches of the Christian tradition. I've been a regular churchgoer and practicing Christian now for how many years? Nearly 45 years. And it's very much part of my life. I've done a number of dialogues with theologians, particularly Matthew Fox. I have a series of dialogues which I do with Mark Vernon, who's an Anglican philosopher. And so I'm very interested in theological questions and Christian practice.
Yeah, I do actually really love the mystical theological tradition, and this is more for my own curiosity. Are there certain thinkers that you tended to gravitate toward within that tradition?
Well, I mean, the Father Bede himself was a very good example of that tradition. The philosophical work that I find most interesting, really, from the Middle Ages is St. Thomas Aquinas. And the recent theologian I've liked most, who I think explores the Christian tradition and its mystical roots, and that which links it to other traditions, is David Bentley Hart, an American theologian. I would say he's one of my favorite theologians at the moment.
Yeah, John actually knows David Bentley Hart, and behind me, the blue set collection is actually Thomas Aquinas. So you're hitting people that we have mutual interests in.
Mm.
So just to sort of pivot into the topic of today, you've done a lot of work in the topic of telepathy and sort of mind-to-mind connection, the very obviously taboo subject of parapsychology. What initially sparked your interest and involvement in getting into this?
Well, I think that one of the problems, one of the reasons that, at least here in Europe, a large number of people become atheists is because they think that the materialist worldview, which is the dominant worldview of the sciences, is true. They think this is scientifically true. And the materialist worldview is essentially atheistic. What it says is that the universe is made up of matter. Matter is unconscious. The whole universe is unconscious, except for human brains and possibly animal brains as well. But then they can't explain why we are conscious, because they think the entire universe is unconscious. There's no consciousness out there. There's no God, no spirits, no angels. Nothing in the universe is conscious except us. Then the very existence of human consciousness is a problem. It's called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind. And they think that human consciousness emerges from the brain, the activity of the brain inside the head. Now, that means all our consciousness should be inside our heads and couldn't have any effect outside our heads or relate to anything outside our heads except through our senses, our speech, our actions, and so on. From their point of view, God is simply an illusion produced inside human brains that's produced by people who are credulous enough to believe in fairy tales and make-believe stories. So it's a very dismissive and contemptuous view, really, of religion. And along with that, there's a taboo within science against telepathy and other psychic phenomena. Telepathy means feeling at a distance, distance, pathy, feeling. And it's about the way that people can pick up other people's feelings or needs at a distance. So this is considered impossible within contemporary science, because if the mind is nothing but the brain, there's no way my thoughts could influence someone else. Now, it seemed to me that if telepathy exists, it would show that the mind is more than just the brain. It would show that the materialist picture is wrong, at least in relation to everyday psychic phenomena. And I don't think these psychic phenomena like telepathy are anything much to do with spirituality. I think they're to do with, as it were, horizontal connections between people or between people and animals. I think they're part of our normal biological nature. And because of that, I first started studying these with animals, particularly dogs and cats. I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, which is about dogs that know when their owners are coming home, that dogs, many dogs go and wait by a door or window when someone's on the way home, even if they're coming at unpredictable times. And I did lots of experiments, filming the dogs all the time the person was out. We had people come home at random times. They didn't know them in advance. We told them by a mobile phone when to come home. And we also had them come home in unfamiliar vehicles. So the dog couldn't be reacting either to routine or to familiar car sounds, or indeed to people at home knowing when the person was coming, because the people at home, if there were people at home, didn't know when they were coming. And over again, these dogs got up and started waiting 15, 20 minutes before the person came home. They were responding to their intention to come home telepathically. We eliminated all other possible explanations. And this work is published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So I found that there was a lot of evidence for telepathy in dogs and cats. And then I found that many mothers are telepathic with their babies. Again, this is very biological. A nursing mother, if she leaves her baby at home, goes back to work or goes shopping, many nursing mothers have found that when they do that, their milk lets down, their breasts start squeezing out milk, when they're away from the baby, and most of them assume their baby needs them, and they go home, or they now ring home on a mobile phone, and they're usually right. And I've done studies showing that this, again, seems to be largely telepathic. It's not just a matter of routine feeding times. It's very biological. And I think that, it makes total sense, because before the invention of telephones, the only way a mother could have known when her baby needed her, if it was out of earshot, was telepathically. Mothers that responded to their baby's needs at a distance would have babies that survived better than mothers that didn't respond. So, and then the commonest kind in the modern world is telephone telepathy. About 85% of the population have had the experience of thinking of someone who shortly afterwards calls on the phone, and they say, "It's funny, I was just thinking about you." I think it's because when you want to talk to someone, you have the intention to talk to them, then you get the phone out and you dial them. And so, but when you form that intention, I think they pick up your need to talk to them telepathically. And again, we've done lots of experiments that show it's not just coincidence. In our tests, the subject is filmed. They have 4 callers, people they know well. We pick one of the 4 callers at random and ask them to call the person. They call, and before they answer the phone or pick up the receiver, and we do it with landlines, so there's no caller ID, they have to guess who it is. I think it's John. Hi, John. They're right or they're wrong. 1 in 4 chance of being right by just guessing, 25%. The hit rate in these experiments is nearly 50%. It's, again, very significant statistically. We've published this in peer-reviewed journals. So I think telepathy is simply a biological fact. It's a way that members of social groups in animals and in people have of communicating with each other at a distance. It's not scary. It's not spiritual. It's certainly not anything to do with sort of devil worship or anything like that. It's just a normal biological thing, and no more or no less spiritual than the sense of smell or the sense of hearing or something like that.
Well, thank you for that excellent summary of your research on the subject. Is there research that's been done outside of your own studies that you found particularly compelling?
Well, yes, quite a number of people have replicated the telephone telepathy work. And so it's not just me that's done this, but there have been laboratory research on telepathy. It's much more artificial than my own. I try to do work under kind of real life conditions. But there's been a lot of research done in parapsychology departments on so-called Ganzfeld telepathy. What happens there is that someone lies reclining in a chair with half ping pong balls over their eyes and white noise through earphones. This is to create a sense of relaxation, sensory deprivation, which is more conducive to telepathy than busily getting on with a job. Your mind has to be fairly open to receive these influences. Then, meanwhile, in another room, the sender looks at a randomly selected video. There's a pool of 4 different videos. One's selected at random. It might show a scene of someone skiing downhill. And then the person who's lying there relaxed in the laboratory room has to say what kind of images they're getting. And they may get images of people gliding downhill on skis, something like that. And after the session's over, they're shown 4 clips, the pool of 4 clips, and asked to identify which one is most like what they saw. And if they identify someone skiing downhill, as opposed, for example, to someone shopping in a supermarket, then that's called a hit. They get it right. 1 in 4 chance of getting it right by just guessing. And these experiments have been widely repeated, replicated in labs all over the world, and have consistently given above chance significant results, showing that people can pick up images telepathically. So there's a lot of that research. But I think the main evidence for telepathy is the fact it just happens all the time in everyday life. I mean, it's one of what I call the mysteries of everyday life. Um, Most people have had experiences of telephone telepathy, and I'm sure anyone listening to this, if they haven't had one themselves, bring it up with family or friends or a group at church, and say, have you ever had this experience? And my guess is that most people will say yes. And they just know who's calling before they look at the caller ID, even if it's an unexpected call. It doesn't happen every time, of course, but it's very common. And again, I predict that if anyone who's listening asks their friends and family members or people at church, if they've got dogs or cats, whether their dog or cat knows when a member of the family is coming home, I'd guess that roughly half of the people with dogs or cats would say yes. This is very, very common. These things are happening all the time. And any mothers who are watching this, who've had babies and who've breastfed them, may have had this experience. It's quite likely some will have had this experience of their milk letting down, their breast squeezing out milk when they're away from the baby at a time when the baby actually needed them. So these are very, very common everyday phenomena.
Well, and I think the skeptic would say something like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And you're kind of suggesting this isn't actually that extraordinary. This happens all the time in our daily lives and across cultures, and it's not that out there.
Well, exactly. What I'm saying is that this isn't an extraordinary claim at all. It's an ordinary claim. If 85% of people experience telephone telepathy, that's ordinary. If 50% of dogs, according to our surveys, know when owners are coming home, and they do it almost daily, that means there's millions of dogs in the US doing this every day. That's not extraordinary. It's not like some incredibly rare, miraculous type event. These are everyday phenomena. What's extraordinary is the claim by the skeptics that these phenomena are impossible and therefore don't exist. They've got no reason for saying that other than a kind of materialist prejudice, which is essentially part of the atheist worldview.
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you brought up the church-going people, because I actually had a church small group, and I go to quite a conservative church, and brought it up to one of the ministers who's in the small group with me that I was interviewing you. And we got talked about a mother's intuition. And while he was saying, yeah, I can kind of see that, his wife overheard the conversation, got between us and said, it's absolutely true. And I thought that was one of the funniest things in the world, is how dead set she was on that fact, and actually started off a conversation among the women about all their experiences with it. So it was actually quite enlightening to hear this from women themselves. And of all people, my own mother-in-law, when I brought up this fact to her, and she's as conservative as a conservative Christian gets, and she says, I know that I have an intuition with my children. So it's not quite as a taboo when we, depending on how we frame it, as you might think it would be.
Well, I don't think there's any reason for Christians to treat this as a taboo. I mean, the reason it's a taboo in our society is because it's a taboo for atheistic materialists. Their worldview is so narrow and actually so dogmatic that they believe the mind is nothing but the inside of the brain. There's no consciousness out there except other people's. So it's a taboo for them, and they've tried to make it a cultural taboo because it doesn't fit with their dogmatic worldview. But there's absolutely no reason why Christians should adopt this so-called scientific taboo. I mean, the Bible's full of extraordinary events, prophetic dreams, miraculous happenings, miraculous healings. And of course, all those things go on today. And so, and of course, the skeptics are against all those too. And actually, one reason they're so against telepathy is they think if you allow anything to be accepted as real that isn't confined to the inside of the head, allow telepathy, and then the next thing people will start saying, well, what about faith healing? What about miracles and stuff? And religion will come back. So they feel they've got to stop belief in telepathy to prevent people being religious. But actually, as I'm saying, it's a different question. There's actually I think telepathy and things are just biological, natural, normal things that haven't got anything particular to do with religion. But I think they do show that our minds are much more extensive than our brains, that our minds are not confined to the inside of our heads. And after all, no Christian really should believe that, because if you believe the mind is nothing but the brain, and the other materialist belief, which I discuss in my book, Sound Set Free, is that memories are stored inside the brain. Again, that's totally standard materialist dogma. They've never proved that memories are in the brain. They just assume they must be. Then if all memories are in the brain, then when you die and the brain decays, all memories will be wiped out. And so there'd be no possible survival of bodily death in any personal form if all your memories had been eliminated. So I think that actually the materialist worldview favors an atheist outlook. I was one myself for quite a while, and the materialist scientific worldview seemed like proof that these things couldn't happen. But one has to realize that the materialist worldview is itself extremely dogmatic, and it's an assumption that minds are nothing but brains and memories are stored inside heads and so on.
Would you say that prayer almost sort of presupposes a sort of telepathic medium, or is that going too far? The sense that what I'm thinking here somehow goes to God, or is that a stretch?
Well, no, I don't think it's a stretch. I think if insofar as I'm praying, and I pray every day, and I'm sure you do too, and many people listening to us may do as well, insofar as one's praying silently, the prayer presupposes that God can hear and respond to our prayers, even though they're silent, even though they're in English. And if people pray in Portuguese or Spanish or Japanese, then the assumption is that God can understand all languages, and that these prayers are comprehensible to God. God can hear them, acknowledge them, be aware of them in a way that has to be rather like telepathy. And also, if you think about it, if I'm praying for a friend who's sick, who lives 100 miles away, though I'm asking God to bless or heal that person, then I'm asking God through prayers in my mind here, then either God has to be able to work at a distance, or my intention for that person connects me to that person and brings them into God's presence through my prayers. But there's a linkage across space when you're praying for someone. All of us can pray for people who are not in the room with us, or situations that are remote from us at a distance. And this therefore means that there's a connection across space through our prayers and our intentions, which is, if not telepathic, akin to telepathy, or telepathy involves people picking up intentions at a distance, like my intention to call on the phone. And prayers are about intentions that we're sharing with God, or asking God to help realize, or bringing before God, to put it most neutrally. So I think intentions reach out beyond our brains to affect what we're intending.
Yeah, I just kind of wrestling with this idea that this taboo originated from a sort of materialistic paradigm that's infiltrated science. Do you think that that's also the cause of why the church in some sectors has been reluctant to admit the existence of this phenomena as well?
Kind of unwittingly.
Yes, I think that most modern Christians, especially in Protestant countries, have been heavily influenced by the scientific worldview, and that have simply absorbed most of this from the surrounding culture. I mean, if you go to traditional Roman Catholic countries, southern Italy, or Orthodox countries like Greece, people don't have a problem with telepathy and psychic phenomena. They're just part of traditional folk culture. People don't have a problem with telepathy in India or in Africa. And after all, there are millions and millions of Christians in Africa. It's just taken for granted that this is part of life. This is going on. It's not seen as particularly pro or anti-religious. It's just the way that things are. And so I think that any taboo that exists in modern Christian denominations is simply absorbed from, ironically, absorbed from the atheistic materialist culture within which we're all embedded. I don't think of anything in the Bible that is against telepathy. There are certainly things against spirit mediums like in the Old Testament, Saul and the witch of Endor. But I can't think of anything that is against telepathy. In fact, it's rather taken for granted. You know, when Jesus says, I've forgotten which disciple he sees under the fig tree. Can remember which one he sees under the fig tree, and then says, I saw you under the fig tree. And the disciple says, you're truly the Lord. And he says, oh, there are many greater things than this. He's rather dismissive of something that could be, in fact, a telepathic impression. So there's nothing in the life of Jesus that suggests he was against psychic phenomena. He was highly intuitive. And when St. Paul and the road to Damascus has his blinding light and he falls down blind, then when in Damascus, you know, again, I've forgotten the name of the person who's praying there, who gets the message that he should go to Paul and welcome him and greet him, because this has happened. And you could say it's been mediated directly through God, but you could say there's also a kind of telepathic link, that something's happened to St. Paul, this other person picks it up and responds to it. They're both connected through prayer. But again, there's this link at a distance connecting them. And there's nothing in the New Testament suggests there's anything wrong with that. It's just taken for granted that these kinds of things are possible.
I thought it was interesting that you brought up some of the more spiritualist sort of Endor type stuff. Do you think it's perhaps that we've come to associate telepathy with sort of spiritual mediums and more new age phenomenon, that we've, as Christians and the church, felt like we had to distance ourselves from that? But when you actually look at the phenomenon of telepathy in and of itself, apart from these broader movements, there's not really that much to take issue with.
No, well, I mean, I can certainly see the reasons for not wanting to get involved with spiritualistic communications with the dead. I mean, I don't do that myself and don't advise people to do it. Apart from anything else, I think it's probably rather disruptive for the dead, you know, to be disturbed on their journey, dragged back to a séance room somewhere. But you know, spirit mediumship is a very different thing from telepathy. There are a limited number of people who claim to have these gifts as spirit mediums. I mean, it's quite rare. Whereas telepathy is extremely common, and it's, you know, common among dogs and cats and numerous other species of animals. It's got nothing to do with spirit mediums. But I think that could possibly be one reason why people have sort of tried to lump it together with, you know, it's the kind of thing witches might have been able to do, and therefore it's sort of possibly diabolical or something. But it seems to me a very tenuous line of argument, and one that's unnecessarily motivated by fear, because I think it's normal, natural, and perfectly biological. So I think, yes, I think that could be one reason why some people have this taboo. But mainly, as I say, I think it's because it's picked up in the modern Western world from the scientific materialism that surrounds us. And so I say, it's very, very rare to find this taboo in in other cultures among Christians.
Now, what I find fascinating in reading in your works is that you're considering things like telepathy, like dogs who can know when their owners are coming home. You're considering things that any other self-respecting scientist would say that they can't really entertain. And it seems like this stemmed from your religious belief. But the story that I'm often hearing is that religious belief creates closed-mindedness, that it closes doors, it gives you answers, it doesn't open questions. Do you see your own biography as in a sense a contradiction to that narrative, as promoting open-mindedness and allowing for questions that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to ask?
Well, I don't think my interest in telepathy arose directly from my Christian belief. What it did arise from is a challenging of the materialist worldview. And modern science is based not on the fundamental beliefs of modern science are not empirical facts. They're assumptions that come from a particular philosophy of nature, namely the materialist philosophy of nature, which treats nature as a machine. The materialism says nature is a machine made of mechanical activities of unconscious matter. There's no purpose in nature. Evolution has happened with no purpose or direction. The mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. There's no consciousness out there. There's certainly no God out there. This is the materialist worldview. And as I said earlier, it is essentially atheistic. Now, that worldview is based on a set of assumptions which are extremely dogmatic. In my book, Science Set Free, I take the principal 10 dogmas of materialism and I turn them into questions and show that they don't do very well if you take them as scientific hypotheses and look at the evidence. Most of them have no evidence. There's no evidence that the universe is a machine, for example. It's just a metaphor. And traditional societies, including traditional Christian philosophers, have thought of the world as more like an organism. The universe is more like an organism than like a machine. I mean, after all, the Big Bang model that cosmology now has is much more like the Big Bang's like the hatching of a cosmic egg. And actually, it's not very far from the description in the first chapter of Genesis, where you have a separation of light and darkness, and then a separation of land and water, and and then the earth bringing forth plants. I mean, the book of Genesis doesn't say God individually designed animals and plants like machines. It says God said, let the earth bring forth vegetation, let the seas bring forth life, living creatures. And it's theologically called mediate creation. God empowers nature to bring forth life, empowers the earth and the sea to bring forth life. God doesn't individually, like an external engineer outside nature, individually design them. That idea that they're machines and therefore God's got to be an engineer outside nature designing them is, again, ironically, totally steeped in scientific materialism as an assumption. The biblical account is much more organic. Nature is much more organic and non-mechanical. There's nothing in the Bible that says nature's a machine. So that assumption of materialism is, as I say, it's just an assumption. You can't actually prove nature's a machine. And it implies a kind of theology, which I think leads to atheism. If you say nature's a machine, then you say God's like a machine maker outside nature who designs and makes the world machine and then presses the start button. And then nature goes on automatically without God. And then God becomes more or less irrelevant. And if you say, then God intervenes through the occasional miracle by suspending the laws of nature, basically anyone who believes that has conceded the materialist worldview, and then you've got to try and squeeze God in. But any true understanding of the divine relationship to nature is that God not only is a creator, but sustains the entire universe from moment to moment. Without God as the ground of all being, the whole universe would cease to exist. So it's not as if God's just there to start it off. And most atheists like Richard Dawkins, who attack Christianity, are attacking the view of a God outside nature who designs the laws of nature and starts the universe off in the first place, and then more or less retires, which is a very, very misleading view of God, and not a biblical view at all, and not a Christian view. So they're refuting a God in whom many Christians don't believe in the first place. Certainly, I don't believe in that kind of God.
In your experience, talking with respectable public scientists and figures, do you find that they're often in conversation quite open to telepathy, quite open to rejecting materialism, but then they're just, I can't publicly say this. I can privately be interested, but publicly I can't be associated with this. Has that been your experience?
Oh, yes, very much so. Most scientists have actually had these, they're normal people, most of them. So most scientists have had telepathic experiences with telephones. Many of them have dogs that know when they're coming home from the laboratory. Most scientists have had these experiences because, and many women scientists who are mothers have had the experience of telepathy with their babies or children. Yes, they've had these experiences, but most of them don't dare talk about them with their colleagues because of this taboo. And I find that there's a very strong contrast between what scientists are prepared to say in public and what they believe and think in private. We recently organized some surveys in Britain, France, and Germany of practicing scientists, engineers, and medical professionals. About 25% are atheists in Britain, about 20% agnostic. So 45% of practicing scientists, engineers, and medical people call themselves non-religious, but about 45% call themselves religious or spiritual, but not religious or spiritual. So it's about equal numbers that are non-religious and religious or spiritual. And yet the kind of atheistic, anti-religious tone of atheists, public atheists like Richard Dawkins or P.Z. Myers or Jerry Coyne, a couple of American militant atheists, the tone they set makes most people believe that most scientists are atheistic, dogmatic materialists. Actually, they're not. But when they're at work, they're afraid they'll be attacked if they deviate from or violate these taboos. They live in fear of of being attacked by other scientists for violating these beliefs or dogmas. In my experience, is much more dogmatic within science. Scientists are much more dogmatic than most religious people I know. And so I would say that my own, I find a greater freedom in thinking and discussing on religious questions and spiritual questions than I do discussing science with scientists, where the taboos and the limits on what you can say and think are much narrower and much more intolerant.
Thank you so much. One final question. I know I've been pressing you to align this idea of telepathy sort of with a religious framework, even though it is a purely biological phenomenon. But one place where I did see in your work that you really entertain and really sort of bring the two together was your book, Physics of Angels, that you wrote with Matthew Fox. And I thought that was just a fascinating work. And I was curious if as a final sort of send-off, if you could tell us a little bit of what place do you see of angels in this organic view of the cosmic? What place do angels hold?
Well, what Matthew Fox and I do in our book on angels is look at the classic Western texts on angels. Dionysius the Areopagite, a 6th century Christian theologian, Hildegard of Bingen, a medieval visionary abbess, one of the most powerful religious women voices from the Middle Ages, and St. Thomas Aquinas. And their view of angels is, of course, much more nuanced than the kind of new agey sort of an angel helped me when my car broke down type of story. We're dealing here with a cosmic phenomenon. And what Aquinas and these other thinkers saw was that angels were minds or intelligences lower than the divine level, but higher than the human level, or at least different from the human level, whose job it was to govern and organize aspects of the natural world. So some of the angels are concerned, there are 9 levels of angels according to this medieval classification. And it starts with cherubim, seraphim, and thrones, which are the angels of the divine love, divine presence, and divine knowledge. And they're like cosmic principles of love, presence, and knowledge of God. And then there's dominions, virtues, and powers, which are celestial angels, which organize the heavenly bodies, the stars, and the planets. And according to the medieval view, these stars and planets were living beings. They were alive. And they were governed by intelligences. The angels, the angel of, say, Jupiter or the star Sirius would be like the mind of that star, which would help to guide it and govern it. And so they were really forms of consciousness beyond the human level. And then there were the angels that governed whole areas of the earth, principalities, continents, and archangels governing whole groups of people, and then individual angels for individual people like guardian angels, and also for plants and animals. The angels were these intelligences that governed and influenced nature, including us. So our own guardian angels, according to that view, are not just an isolated phenomenon in an otherwise mechanical universe. They're part of a universe that's full of life and intelligence. And so the one reason that Matthew Fox and I wrote this book was to recover a sense of animated nature, living nature, which is what the world in which Jesus grew up, the world of the Old Testament. Nature's alive, not dead and mechanical. In the Middle Ages, the theology of the church was definitely saw nature as animate. The animals and plants were living beings with souls, not necessarily immortal souls like the human, but the very word animal comes from the Latin word anima, which means soul, as in animate beings. So again, the idea that the only kind of spirituality, mind, or consciousness confined to humans and then to human brains is, again, ironically, a product of modern Western materialist science, not a traditional Christian doctrine. And angels remind us of this much larger and more mysterious worldview, full of life and energies, with which we interact, with which God interacts. But some of them are not primarily about humans. The ones that govern the heavens, the angels governing the heavens, are really about keeping the whole order of nature going. And then they can appear to us giving messages or visions, as they do repeatedly. There's hundreds of examples of angels in the Old and the New Testaments. Again, they were taken for granted as beings, but they, of course, the main emphasis there is on ones that interact with humans and give messages. And the very word angel in Greek comes from the word for messenger. But the vision that our Christian predecessors had was much wider than that, because they were so involved as animating principles, as intelligences, as creative principles in nature. And interestingly, one of the founders of the theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, who, like Charles Darwin, thought up the idea of natural selection, was quite unlike Darwin in his interpretation of evolution. Instead of saying that evolution happened by chance or through blind forces or in a kind of materialistic way, Wallace thought that, that natural selection weeded out unsuccessful organisms. I mean, that's pretty much common sense. But he thought that creative power was a creative intelligences working through nature, And he didn't think that God did everything directly. He thought that God's creativity was expressed in the evolutionary process through the guidance of the angels. And in his last book, The World of Life, 1921, he actually describes how he thought of angels as guiding and as being creative principles, guiding animals and plants in the evolutionary process, and being a source of inspiration and creativity to them. Now, in all of this, of course, these angelic intelligences are rather mysterious, but they're certainly not humanoid beings with colored wings as seen in stained glass windows. I mean, they may appear to some people in that form, but that's not how traditional Christian thinkers have thought about them. They thought about them in a much more sophisticated and in my opinion, more interesting way.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, please consider subscribing and leaving us a 5-star review. We're an up-and-coming podcast, and every little bit helps. Also consider joining our Patreon page. Patreon sponsors have exclusive access to unaired episodes, different kinds of merchandise, the ability to suggest an episode, and even an hour-long interview with Jonathan and I. Check it out at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com and see what you're missing out on. Sound effects from zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.